In the mid-1950s, the US had a dilemma on their hands. They had just split the atom and were finding new and interesting ways of using it. There were plans to use nuclear bombs to make new harbours, make new canals, and even make lakes. And beyond that, they were planning to power everything with the atom. Whole cities powered by a single reactor, or even a single home fitted with a miniature reactor that wouldn't need refuelling for 50 years. There were even going to be nuclear cars, nuclear buses, nuclear trains, nuclear ships, and even nuclear planes. But when it came to the bomb, there was a massive problem on the horizon. In the event of war, how are you going to deliver a bomb to your enemy? It was simple enough when they attacked Japan. Japan was out of planes, manpower, and fuel when B-29s flew over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But their next target, the USSR, by the 1950s, not only did they have all the planes you could ever need, they had planes like the MiG-15, which were easily able to intercept B-29s, and the B-29's replacement, the B-36. In fact, they had been easily intercepting the B-29s over the skies of Korea. The bombers America had in service, or nearing service, would be incredibly vulnerable to fast fighter interceptors. And with the advent of guided anti-air missiles, any attempt to fly over in a big lumbering bomber wouldn't stand a chance. Now, the US knew this was a problem, and had started developing ways to deliver nuclear weapons without even entering Soviet territory. The cruise missile. These had already existed for over a decade by this time, having first been used by the Germans with their V-1 buzz bombs. Cruise missiles could be launched from land, air, or sea, from well beyond enemy territory. However, cruise missiles of that age were very limited by range. The land-launched Matador missile had a range of about 400 kilometers, and while the submarine-launched Regulus missile had a range of about 800 kilometers, it required the submarine to surface within range of enemy fire. So what are they to do? They need something that can be launched from anywhere in the world, with a range that can hit any part of the Soviet Union, and can avoid being intercepted by anything the Russians had. Finally, one boffin, presumably after his 10th line of coke that morning, came up with a solution. Why don't we make a nuclear-powered missile? Now, like I said at the start, people had theorized using nuclear reactors to power airplanes since they first split the atom. The problem was just how to do it. There are two ways of using the heat from a reactor to produce thrust. The first method, and the simplest, is to have the reactor directly heat the air, also known as direct air cycle. This would help cool the reactor while heating the air so that it can produce thrust. The downside to this method is that the air that touches the reactor becomes heavily irradiated with reactor material, meaning anything you flew over would be covered in fallout. The second method, also known as indirect air cycle, required the reactor to be cooled by liquid metal. The liquid metal would pass through a heat exchanger, and this is what would heat the air, producing thrust. This method got rid of the radioactive fallout, but it also reduced the amount of thrust you could make. This is also incredibly heavy, what with the liquid metal. In fact, weight was the biggest downside to nuclear-powered manned aircraft. Even a very simple direct airflow engine would weigh a lot, and the lead you would have to carry around to protect the crew means you wouldn't have much in the way of payload at the end of the day. Also, a plane with no range limitations does still have to deal with crew fatigue, because even if you have multiple crew on board working in shifts, they would still have to live in a droning steel box for days on end. Which is why manned nuclear flight remained on the drawing board, though this is probably a subject for another day. But what if the plane didn't have to have any crew? Or you didn't even care where the fallout landed? What if it could fly so fast that the shockwave alone could destroy a building? May I introduce to you Project Pluto. Project Pluto is rather simple on paper. It's a 30.5 metre long missile powered by a nuclear ramjet that could fly at 3 times the speed of sound, also known as Mach 3, even at sea level. Capable of dropping multiple bombs on multiple targets in its flight path, it would also use its shockwave to level anything left standing, all the while irradiating anything it flew over. and it could continue to do this for 31 hours after it was launched. Then, when its reactor ran out of energy, it would plummet in the ground, spreading even more radiation. Yes, America wanted to build a missile that was seemingly an attempt to beat the any percent speed run for war crimes. An initial study was done in 1947, but it was only in 1955 did the US Department of Defense start asking the Atomic Energy Commission to start developing an engine and reactor. By the early 1960s, the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory had begun building the Troy 2 series of engines. However, when it came to testing these new engines, a new problem emerged. How do you test such an engine at Mach 3? You can't just attach it to a plane because there isn't a plane available that can go Mach 3. The Blackbird hadn't yet reached service, and it was too small for the task anyway. You can't attach it to a rocket because you need to recover the motor after the test, and a rocket is a one-and-done deal. Also, you can't do any of these tests anywhere near water or anywhere inhabited because of the fallout. So where can you go on dry land that's hundreds of miles from any living thing? Nevada, of course. The US have already done all their nuclear testing there, so what harm can you really do? The next problem was, how do you funnel enough air to simulate flying at Mach 3? The solution they came up with was incredibly simple, if not mad. They built a giant tank farm filled with 45 kilometers of oil well pipes, storing 540 tons of air at 340 bar. It would take a full 5 days to fill the farm for each test, and each test could only last 5 minutes of simulated flight time. To put that into perspective, to simulate the full 31 hours of flight time, it would take a full year of constant testing. By 1963, they had finally built an engine that was suitable for the job. Now they just had to start building everything else. Vought was tasked with building the airframe of the missile. Exact dimensions are a bit hard to find, but we do know it would have been over 30 meters long. It would have had 3 small fins used to steer and stabilize the missile in flight, and a giant intake on the underside to feed air directly into the reactor. Because of this, the weapons bay had to be located on the top of the fuselage. Otherwise, there was a risk of bombs striking the intake during flight. Weapons load was estimated to be around 250 kilograms, and would be made up of anything from 46 5-kiloton bombs, or just one big 28 megaton bomb. It would be made mostly of stainless steel, however certain areas would be gold-plated to prevent damage from the extreme heat. Its guidance system would be incredibly advanced for its time, and would wind up being used on US missiles all the way up until the 1970s. It would carry a small database of terrain radar mapping data and compare that data with radar signals coming from the missile's onboard radar system. All this with only 64 kilobytes of storage and 16 kilobytes of RAM. Or to put it another way, 10 times less RAM than the Atari 2600. Despite all this amazing tech and impressive performance, there was a brand new problem on the horizon. And it's the one problem you cannot engineer or design your way out of. Money. At the start of development, the cost of one missile was projected to be $5 million, around $36 million in today's money. But by 1964, the cost had risen to anything from $10 to $20 million, or $95 to $190 million in today's money. To put that into perspective, the most advanced bomber then available, the B-52, cost between $8 and $9 million to make, or $76 to $90 million today. All that for a missile that can only be used once, whereas a bomber can be used many, many, many times. So with that, in July 1964, the plug was pulled. Some testing was done on the Troy 2 engine up to 1965, but after that, all work was cancelled. Total cost of the project is estimated to be $260 million, or $2.8 billion in today's money. So that was the end of Project Pluto. However, while I was researching for this video, I discovered a system that somehow is even crazier, but is also incredibly familiar to Project Pluto. You see, while this was all going on, The Department of Defense had been asking for ideas from multiple different US aerospace companies for nuclear-powered supersonic flying boats. The reasoning behind this request was that in the event of nuclear war, most airfields and runways would be cratered in the first strike, meaning any attempt to strike back after the first wave would be severely limited. But what if you didn't need a runway, but just a long stretch of water? Hence the flying boat idea. Nothing really came of it, mainly due to the same reasons other nuclear-powered bomber designs never made it off the drawing board. But one of the ideas they put forward sounded awfully familiar. Convair, the same company that built the massive B-36 Peacemaker and America's first supersonic bomber, the B-58 Hustler, came up with an insane idea. It would have the same basic mission profile as Pluto, Mach 3 speed, low-level flight, nuclear-powered ramjet, but with the added complexity of both being manned and submersible. What, really? It was called, rather creatively, the Convair Submersible Nuclear Ramjet. It would spend 90% of its time sailing around underwater, but rather than use an electric motor to propel itself underwater like every other submarine, it would use its nuclear ramjet to propel itself underwater. That's right, they would blast an open reactor with seawater, because only irradiating the air clearly wasn't enough for them. As this was only a paper proposal, we don't really have all the information as to how big it was, or at least the source I'm using doesn't list it. But we do know it would have weighed around 158 tons when submerged, and 113 tons when flying with a full load. A mission profile would look very similar to Pluto's, but the launch was very different. Like I said, it would skulk around underwater for most of its life. But when it needed to fly, the craft would power up its reactor to its full 3,600 megawatts, rapidly vaporizing the water that's left in its reactor, launching the craft vertically at around 450 kilometers per hour. Once it had completed its mission, it would land very much like a SpaceX booster, going vertical and using the thrust from its engines to slowly lower itself back into the water. Thankfully for everyone involved, it never got beyond the design phase, as even the madmen in the Pentagon didn't want to spend another $1 billion on something that not only would irradiate the air and the land, but also the sea. After the cancellation of Pluto and a move away from nuclear-powered flight, the US never attempted to build anything like Pluto again. Russia, on the other hand, yes, the country with an interesting history of nuclear energy, decided to build a nuclear-powered cruise missile. And not in the 1960s, or the 1970s, or even in the 1980s. They are currently building it, or at least trying to. The 9M730 Burevestnik. Bernavestnik? Ah, bugger it, I'm calling it the Plutoski. Is one of the latest wonder weapons that Russia has started building, along the same lines as its tsunami torpedo. You can't see, but I'm doing the finger quotes. We don't know much about it, other than its rough outline, which is very similar to the US Tomahawk missile, although it is about 50% bigger, and like the Pluto, it's going to use a direct cycle nuclear ramjet. So, how's development going? Well, the first time the West heard anything about the Plutoski was when radiation was detected deep within Russia in 2019. Turns out the thing exploded when they were trying to recover it after a test flight, killing 5 people in the process. Since then, it seems to have had a few more test flights, but this is only according to Russia, so take it with a grain of salt. It's highly unlikely that this is a fully operational weapon system at the moment. The cost of fielding even a few dozen of these missiles would be extortionately expensive, especially during a time when Russia is struggling to pay for strategic bombers, stealth fighters, and new naval vessels to replace its aging Cold War stock, let alone its disastrous war in Ukraine. It seems to resemble more the T-14 or Sukhoi 57 more than actual weapon systems. A propaganda piece designed to scare NATO. So, nothing to worry about, I think. Thank you so much for listening, and have a nice day.